Standing at the rusted gate of Thompson Farm, I turned the key my husband had hidden for 43 years, and what I found inside made me realize I had never truly known the man I shared a bed with for nearly half a century. The silence that followed was deafening, and something inside my chest cracked open like an old wound. Can you imagine discovering that everything you believed about your life partner was carefully constructed fiction? What would you do if the person you mourned wasn't who you thought they were? I stood there in shock, my hands still trembling on that gate. But I already knew that what lay beyond would forever change, not just how I remembered Robert, but who I would become in the days ahead. But before I continue, take a quick look to make sure you're still subscribed. I don't want you to miss any of these eye-opening stories. My name is Janet Allen. I'm 67 years old, and for 41 years I was a high school English teacher before retiring 3 years ago. I married Robert when I was 22, fresh out of college, and we raised 2 children together in our modest home in Cedar Creek. Robert worked as a mechanic his entire life, always coming home with grease under his fingernails and stories about fixing tractors and old pickup trucks. We lived simply, saved carefully, and I thought we told each other everything. I was wrong about that last part. Robert had died suddenly of a heart attack just 6 weeks earlier, leaving me to sort through a lifetime of accumulated belongings and memories. The lawyer had handed me a manila envelope containing property deeds I'd never seen before, including one for Thompson Farm, a 100-acre plot about 15 miles outside town that Robert claimed he'd inherited from a distant uncle years before we met. Whenever I'd asked about visiting or maybe using the land, he'd always waved me off with the same firm words. "Never enter the farm, Janet. It's not safe. Old buildings, unstable ground. Promise me you'll never go there alone." I'd kept that promise for 4 decades, even though something about his tone always made my skin prickle with curiosity. But now, faced with property taxes and maintenance costs I couldn't afford on my teacher's pension, I'd decided to sell the mysterious farm. The real estate agent wanted photographs and a basic assessment before listing it. Just a quick walkthrough, I'd told myself that morning. Take some pictures, lock it up, and let someone else worry about whatever Robert was so afraid of. The drive out had been longer than I'd expected, winding through countryside I'd somehow never explored despite living nearby my entire adult life. When I'd finally found the unmarked dirt road that led to the property, my hands had begun to shake on the steering wheel. The gate itself was newer than I'd anticipated, heavy steel with a complex lock system that seemed oddly sophisticated for abandoned farmland. But it was what I'd seen beyond the gate that made my breath catch. This wasn't the crumbling, dangerous property Robert had always described. The land was meticulously maintained, with neat gravel paths winding between several buildings that looked recently painted and carefully preserved. Someone had been taking care of this place, and that someone couldn't have been Robert. He'd barely had time for our own yard work between his long hours at the shop. As I'd walked closer to the main building, I'd noticed something that made my stomach drop. Tire tracks in the gravel, fresh ones, and not just any tire tracks, the distinctive tread pattern I'd memorized from 43 years of watching Robert pull into our driveway. He'd been coming here, recently, possibly right up until the week he died. What I was about to discover inside that building would make Robert's sudden death seem like the merciful beginning of a nightmare that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, and the quiet life we'd built together. The key to the main building turned easily, as if it had been used yesterday. Inside, the air smelled of fresh wood polish and something else, a familiar cologne that made my knees weak. It was Robert's scent, lingering in a space he'd sworn he never entered. The interior wasn't what you'd expect from a farm building. Someone had converted it into what could only be described as a workshop, but not for mechanical work. The walls were lined with easels, canvases, and art supplies that looked expensive and well-used. Paintings hung everywhere. Landscapes, portraits, abstracts, all signed with initials I recognized, R.A. Robert Allen. My husband, who had claimed he couldn't draw a straight line, had been a painter. I moved through the space like a sleepwalker, touching brushes that still held traces of dried paint, examining canvases that showed a skill developed over years, maybe decades. How long had he been coming here? How had he afforded supplies this extensive on a mechanic's salary? And why had he hidden this beautiful talent from me, from our children, from everyone? In the corner sat a desk with a leather-bound journal lying open. My hands trembled as I picked it up and read the entry dated just 2 weeks before Robert's death. Janet would understand if she knew. But how do you tell someone you've been living a lie for 40 years? How do you explain that you've been hiding the best part of yourself because you were ashamed of dreaming beyond what a poor farm boy was supposed to want? Tears blurred my vision as I flipped through page after page of entries describing his secret visits here, his guilt about the deception, his fear that I would think less of him for wanting something more than the life we'd built together. But there was something else in these pages, mentions of phone calls, of them trying to contact him, of lawyers and documents he needed to hide. I found those documents in a filing cabinet that required yet another key from Robert's secret collection. Inside were medical records dating back 18 months, oncology reports, treatment schedules, prognosis summaries. Robert had known he was dying. He'd been fighting cancer in secret while continuing to work, continuing to pretend everything was normal, continuing to visit this hidden sanctuary where he could be the artist he'd always wanted to be. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. Underneath the medical files was a property assessment that made me sit down hard in Robert's chair. Thompson Farm wasn't just 100 acres of rural land. The geological survey showed oil deposits beneath the property, potentially worth millions of dollars. Recent correspondence with energy companies indicated Robert had been in negotiations for drilling rights for over a year. My simple mechanic husband had been sitting on a fortune. The final document in the stack was a letter addressed to me, sealed but not mailed. My hands shook so badly I could barely tear it open. Robert's familiar handwriting filled 3 pages, explaining everything. The cancer diagnosis he'd hidden to spare me worry. The art that had been his secret passion since childhood. The oil discovery that could secure our children's futures. And most importantly, a warning. My brother Dale and his wife have been calling, asking about the farm. They know about the oil, Janet. They've known longer than I have. Don't trust them when they come to you with sympathy and offers to help. They've been watching and waiting for me to die. I'd barely finished reading when I heard the sound of tires on gravel outside. Through the window, I watched a familiar pickup truck pull up to the gate I'd left open in my shock. Dale Allen, Robert's younger brother, was climbing out with his wife Margaret and their adult son Kenny. They were supposed to be at Robert's memorial service planning meeting across town. Instead, they were here, at the farm Robert had forbidden me to visit, on the day I'd finally discovered why. And what I was about to learn about my husband's family would make his 40-year deception seem like a small kindness compared to the betrayal that was about to unfold. I watched through the window as Dale tried different keys on the gate, cursing when none of them worked. He pulled out his phone, and I could see his mouth moving in what looked like an angry conversation. Margaret kept glancing toward the building where I was hidden, and something about her expression made my blood run cold. She looked like a woman who'd been caught but wasn't surprised about it. My phone buzzed with a text from Dale. "Janet, we drove by the farm and saw your car. We've been worried about you coming here alone. Robert always said it wasn't safe." I didn't respond. Instead, I used those precious moments to photograph every document in Robert's filing cabinet with my phone. Something told me I was going to need proof of what I'd found. 20 minutes later, they managed to scale the fence. I heard footsteps on the gravel, and Dale calling out, "Janet? Honey? We know you're in there. We just want to make sure you're okay." When I opened the door, the 3 of them stood there with expressions that didn't match their concerned words. Dale's eyes immediately went to the paintings on the walls, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not surprise, but calculation. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, stepping inside without invitation. "So this is where Bobby was hiding all these years. You knew about this?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Margaret and Kenny exchanged a look that confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. Dale walked over to examine one of Robert's paintings more closely. "Your husband was full of secrets, wasn't he, Janet? Did you know he was buying up mineral rights across 3 counties for the past 5 years?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, come on now," Margaret said, her voice losing its fake sweetness. "You found the geological reports. You know about the oil. The question is, what are you planning to do about it?" Kenny, who had always seemed like a quiet, respectful young man, was now going through Robert's desk drawers without permission. Where are the drilling contracts, Aunt Janet? We know Uncle Robert signed preliminary agreements. I don't know what you're talking about. But even as I said it, I was backing toward the door, every instinct screaming that I was in danger. Dale stepped between me and the exit. Here's the thing, Janet. Bobby's been sick for over a year, making decisions that weren't, well, let's call them financially sound. Spending money on art supplies, medical treatments that weren't covered by insurance, lawyer fees for all sorts of complicated paperwork. He was dying, I whispered. He was fighting cancer. He was being selfish, Margaret snapped. Spending your children's inheritance on his little hobby here while sitting on a gold mine that could have secured everyone's future. As I tried to connect the dots, I got curious. Where are you listening to me from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I like to imagine these stories echoing in so many different places. Kenny pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph that made my knees go weak. It was Robert, clearly ill and frail, signing documents at a lawyer's office. But he wasn't alone. Dale was sitting right next to him, pointing to specific lines on the papers. You were there, I breathed. You knew he was sick. You knew about the oil, and you let me believe. What we let you believe was that Bobby died peacefully, without any complications, Dale interrupted. What you don't know is that he signed power of attorney over to me 3 weeks before he died. Medical decisions, financial decisions, property management, all of it. I fumbled for my phone, thinking about the photographs I'd taken of Robert's files, but Margaret was faster. She grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Those documents won't help you, honey. See, there's been some confusion about Robert's mental state in his final weeks. The cancer, the pain medications, the stress, it all affected his judgment. Good thing his family was there to help guide him through some difficult decisions. The room seemed to tilt around me as I understood what they were telling me. They hadn't just known about Robert's illness and the valuable property. They had manipulated a dying man into signing away his family's future. And now they were here to make sure I didn't interfere with their plans. My children, I whispered. Sarah and Michael. They need to know about this. Kenny laughed, and the sound was nothing like the respectful young man I'd known at family gatherings. Oh, Aunt Janet, you're going to love this part. We've already been talking to Sarah and Michael, sharing our concerns about your mental state since Uncle Robert died. The grief, you understand. Sometimes it makes people paranoid, makes them see conspiracies where there's just family trying to help. But what I discovered in the next hour would prove that Robert's deception wasn't the only lie that had been carefully constructed around me. My own children had been turned against me, and the trap that was closing around my life had been set in motion long before Robert drew his last breath. Dale pulled out his phone and dialed a number I recognized, my daughter Sarah's ringtone. When she answered, I could hear her voice clearly in the quiet building. Uncle Dale? Did you find her? We've been so worried. She's here at the farm, honey, just like you said she might be. And Sarah, she's acting exactly like you described. Paranoid, confused, going through Robert's things like she's looking for hidden treasure or something. My mouth fell open as I listened to my own daughter discussing me like I was a problematic child who couldn't be trusted. Mom's been talking about conspiracies ever since Dad died, Sarah continued. Yesterday she called me crying, saying she thought someone had been in the house going through Dad's papers. Michael and I are really concerned about her mental state. We understand completely, Margaret chimed in, speaking loud enough for Sarah to hear. Grief affects everyone differently. Sometimes elderly people start imagining things. Elderly people. At 67, I was hardly elderly, but I could hear how they were framing this narrative. The confused widow, overwhelmed by loss, creating drama where none existed. Is Mom there? Can I talk to her? Sarah asked. Dale handed me the phone with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Your daughter wants to speak with you, Janet. Sarah? My voice came out shakier than I'd intended. Mom, what are you doing at that old farm? You know Dad never wanted you going there alone. Uncle Dale says you've been going through private papers that might not even belong to you anymore. Sarah, listen to me carefully. Your father left documents. Mom, stop. Sarah's voice was sharp with frustration. Uncle Dale already explained about Dad's confusion in his final weeks, the medications, the pain. He wasn't thinking clearly. Whatever papers you found, they might not be legally valid. I stared at Dale, who was watching my face with the satisfaction of a man whose plan was working perfectly. "How long have you been talking to Uncle Dale about me? He called us right after the funeral, Mom. He was worried about you being alone, making important decisions while you're grieving. Michael and I think it might be best if Uncle Dale helps manage Dad's affairs until you're feeling more stable." The phone slipped from my numb fingers. Kenny caught it smoothly and ended the call. In that moment, I understood the true scope of what had been done to me. This wasn't just about stealing Robert's property. They had systematically poisoned my relationship with my own children, painting me as mentally unstable so that any discoveries I made would be dismissed as the delusions of a grieving widow. "How long?" I whispered. "How long have you been planning this?" Dale sat down in Robert's chair like he owned it. "Bobby got his diagnosis 18 months ago. That's when we started having real conversations about the future, about making sure family assets stayed in the family, instead of being wasted on medical treatments that weren't going to save him anyway. You convinced him to hide his illness from me." "We convinced him to be practical," Margaret corrected. "All that money he spent on treatments, on this little art hobby, that was money that belonged to his children's inheritance. We were looking out for Sarah and Michael's interests. Kenny was photographing Robert's paintings with his phone. These might actually be worth something on the local art market. We should get them appraised." I watched my husband's secret passion being reduced to dollar signs by people who had never understood that some things matter more than money. "Sarah and Michael don't know about the oil, do they? You haven't told them about the real value of this property." Dale's smile widened. "Why would we worry them with complicated financial details? They're both busy with their own lives, their own families. Better to let experienced family members handle the business side of things." "Experienced family members?" My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You run a failing hardware store, Dale. What do you know about oil rights and mineral deposits?" "I know enough to hire the right lawyers and accountants," he replied smoothly. Unlike Bobby, who was ready to let some slick energy company lowball him because he didn't want to make waves, Margaret stood up and walked to the window, checking outside like she was expecting someone. "The thing is, Janet, we've already started the process of having the property transferred. Robert signed all the necessary paperwork before he died, and with the power of attorney documentation, it's really just a matter of filing the right forms." "And if I fight this?" "With what?" Kenny asked, not looking up from photographing documents. "Your children think you're having a breakdown. You have no independent legal representation. And frankly, at your age, the stress of a prolonged court battle might not be good for your health." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I was trapped in a web that had been woven around me for months, while I'd been grieving a husband who had been forced to choose between protecting me and protecting our children's future. But what none of them knew was that Robert had been smarter than they'd given him credit for. In his final letter, he'd written something that suddenly made perfect sense. "If you're reading this, Janet, then they've already made their move, but I've left you something they don't know about. Something that will give you the power to fight back." I needed to find whatever Robert had hidden before Dale and his family realized that their perfectly planned betrayal had one fatal flaw. They had underestimated the woman Robert had loved enough to protect, even from beyond the grave. Dale's phone rang, and I watched his face change as he answered. "What do you mean someone's been asking questions?" His voice dropped to a harsh whisper, but in the enclosed space, I caught every word. "No, she's right here with us. How could she have... When?" Margaret moved closer to her husband, her earlier confidence wavering. Kenny stopped photographing and focused on his father's conversation, his young face suddenly looking much older and more calculating than I'd ever noticed before. "Who's been asking questions about what?" I demanded, but Dale held up a finger to silence me while he continued his call. Okay, yes, we're handling it. Just make sure he doesn't talk to anyone else until we get back to town." Dale ended the call and looked at his wife with an expression that made my stomach clench with fear. "What's happening?" Margaret asked. "Janet's been busy," Dale said, his eyes fixed on me with new suspicion. "Apparently, she went to see Bobby's lawyer yesterday. Started asking about wills and property transfers and power of attorney documents." I had indeed visited Robert's lawyer, Thomas Brennan, a man who had handled small legal matters for us over the years, but I'd only asked general questions about my rights as a widow. I hadn't mentioned the farm or the oil discovery because I hadn't known about them yet. I was trying to understand Robert's final wishes, I said carefully. Any widow would do the same thing. The problem, Aunt Janet, Kenny said, putting away his phone, is that Mr. Brennan apparently told you some things that weren't really your business. Things about Dad questioning certain documents he'd signed. My heart began to race. Thomas Brennan had indeed mentioned that Robert had called him several times in his final weeks, sounding confused and upset about legal papers he didn't remember signing clearly. But I hadn't understood the significance at the time. Dale stood up abruptly and began pacing the small space like a caged animal. We need to think about this differently. Janet, you're going to help us resolve this situation cleanly. What situation? What are you talking about? Margaret moved to block the door I'd been edging toward. The situation where you've been spreading false information about your dead husband's mental state, making accusations about family members who were only trying to help during a difficult time. I haven't accused anyone of anything. Not yet, Kenny said quietly. But you will. People like you always do. You find some documents you don't understand, and suddenly everyone's a villain trying to steal from you. The way he said people like you made my skin crawl. There was a coldness in my nephew that I'd never seen before, a calculated cruelty that reminded me uncomfortably of his grandfather, Dale's father, who had been known for his ruthless business dealings before he died. Dale's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it and cursed under his breath. Sarah's on her way out here. She's worried about her mother's episode and wants to drive you home personally. Sarah's coming here? We called her after we found you going through Bobby's private things, Margaret explained with fake concern. She's bringing Michael too. They're very worried about your behavior, Janet. All this talk about oil wells and secret bank accounts and family conspiracies. But I hadn't mentioned oil wells or bank accounts to anyone, which meant they were putting words in my mouth, building a case for my instability that they could use to justify whatever they were planning to do next. I heard vehicles approaching outside. Not one car, but several. Through the window, I could see Sarah's Honda pulling up behind Dale's truck, but there were two other vehicles I didn't recognize. Men in suits were getting out of a black sedan, and a woman with a clipboard was emerging from a white van with official-looking logos on the side. Who are those people? I asked, but the sick feeling in my stomach told me I already knew. Those are the people who are going to help us make sure you get the care you need, Dale said gently, his voice taking on the patronizing tone people use when they're about to do something terrible for your own good. Sarah burst through the door with Michael close behind her, both of them looking genuinely distressed. Mom, thank God you're okay. When Uncle Dale called and said you were out here alone, talking about hidden fortunes and family conspiracies, we were terrified. Sarah, listen to me, I started. But she was already wrapping me in a hug that felt more like restraint than comfort. It's okay, Mom. We understand. Losing Dad has been traumatic for all of us. But you can't keep making these accusations against family members who are just trying to help. Michael was looking around at Robert's hidden art studio with amazement, but not surprise. So this is where Dad came when he needed space. Uncle Dale told us about it after the funeral. They had known. My own children had known about Robert's secret sanctuary, and they had kept it from me, just as Dale had instructed them to. The woman with the clipboard entered the building and introduced herself as a social worker, conducting a wellness check based on concerns raised by family members about my mental state and ability to make sound decisions during my grieving process. One of the men in suits was a lawyer who began explaining procedures for temporary guardianship when family members showed signs of confusion or paranoia that might lead to poor financial decisions. I realized with crystal clarity that this had never been about protecting me or helping me through my grief. This had been a carefully orchestrated plan to have me declared mentally incompetent so that Dale could legally control Robert's estate, including the oil-rich farmland that none of them thought I was smart enough to manage. But as the social worker began asking me questions designed to highlight my confused state, I remembered Robert's final words in his letter. I've left you something they don't know about, something that will give you the power to fight back. I had to find whatever Robert had hidden before they succeeded in having me declared unfit to control my own life. And I had to do it while surrounded by family members who had already decided that stealing my future was in my best interest. The walls were closing in, but Robert had been planning for this moment. Somewhere in this building was the key to destroying their carefully constructed web of lies. I just had to stay sane long enough to find it. The social worker's questions were carefully designed to make me sound paranoid. Mrs. Allen, your family is concerned that you've been making accusations about hidden bank accounts and secret oil deposits. Can you tell me where these ideas came from? I looked at the geological survey still lying on Robert's desk, then at Dale's face. He was watching me with the intensity of a man whose entire future depended on my next words. If I mentioned the documents, they would claim I was having delusions. If I didn't, they would use my silence as evidence that I couldn't distinguish between reality and fantasy. The ideas came from my husband's private papers, I said carefully. Papers that I found in this building today for the first time. Sarah squeezed my hand. Mom, Uncle Dale explained that Dad was confused in his final weeks. The cancer medications affected his thinking. He might have written things that weren't accurate. The lawyer stepped forward with a folder. Mrs. Allen, we have medical records showing that your husband was prescribed high doses of morphine and other pain medications that can cause hallucinations and paranoid thoughts. It's very common for terminal patients to become suspicious of family members or to imagine financial conspiracies. But I had read Robert's journal entries dating back months before any serious medical treatment. His handwriting had been steady, his thoughts clear and organized. The man who had written those pages wasn't confused or paranoid. He was methodically documenting a betrayal he knew was coming. Michael walked over to examine one of Robert's paintings more closely. These are really good, Mom. I had no idea Dad was artistic. None of us did, I replied, watching Dale's reaction. He kept this talent hidden for 43 years, just like he kept other things hidden. The social worker made a note on her clipboard. Mrs. Allen, do you think your husband was deliberately deceiving you about important aspects of his life? It was a trap question. If I said yes, it would support their narrative that I was becoming paranoid about Robert's motives. If I said no, it would contradict the evidence of this secret art studio. I think my husband was protecting me from something, I said finally. And I think the people who are here today know what that something was. Dale's phone rang again. He answered it with visible irritation, walking to the far corner of the room. But his voice carried, and what I heard made my blood freeze. What do you mean the body showed traces of digitalis? We agreed that the heart attack was natural. No one's going to exhume anything. The death certificate is signed and filed. Margaret grabbed her husband's arm and hissed something I couldn't hear. But Dale's face had gone pale. He ended the call and looked at me with something that might have been fear. Who was that? The lawyer asked. Nobody important, just business matters. But I had heard enough. Digitalis, a plant-derived compound that could cause heart attacks in people with existing heart conditions. Robert had mentioned chest pains in his final journal entries, but he'd attributed them to stress. What if they hadn't been natural symptoms? What if someone had been slowly poisoning him? I must have made some sound, because suddenly everyone in the room was looking at me. Sarah rushed to my side. Mom, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I have, I whispered, staring at Dale. Maybe I've seen exactly what I was supposed to see. The social worker scribbled more notes. Mrs. Allen, are you experiencing visual hallucinations? It's not uncommon during periods of extreme grief. Kenny had been suspiciously quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. Aunt Janet, you're scaring everyone. First the paranoia about family stealing from you, now you're talking about seeing ghosts. Don't you think it might be time to let people who care about you help make some decisions? People who care about me wouldn't have spent months convincing my husband to hide his illness while they positioned themselves to steal his property after he died. The words came out before I could stop them, and the room fell completely silent. Dale's face darkened, and I saw him exchange a look with the lawyer that confirmed everything I'd begun to suspect. Mrs. Allen, the lawyer said smoothly, these are very serious accusations. Do you have any evidence to support these claims? I thought about Robert's journal, about the geological survey, about the medical records hidden in the filing cabinet. But I also thought about the phone call I'd just overheard, the mention of digitalis, the concern about exhuming bodies, the clear implication that Robert's death might not have been as natural as everyone believed. The evidence is in this room, I said, gesturing toward Robert's desk. In his journals, in the property assessments, in the correspondence with energy companies. My husband documented everything. Dale stepped forward. Janet, those papers you found, they're not what you think they are. Bobby was confused, scared, imagining threats that didn't exist. The journal entries you're talking about are the ramblings of a sick man who was afraid of dying. But as he spoke, I noticed something that made my heart race. Dale was wearing Robert's watch, a distinctive vintage Omega that Robert had treasured because it had belonged to his father. I'd looked everywhere for that watch after the funeral, wanting to give it to Michael as a keepsake. "Where did you get Robert's watch?" I asked quietly. Dale looked down at his wrist as if seeing the watch for the first time. "Bobby, he gave it to me before he died. Said he wanted me to have something to remember him by. He would never have given that watch away. He was saving it for Michael." Sarah looked between me and her uncle with growing confusion. "Mom, maybe Dad changed his mind about the watch. People do that when they're facing death." But Michael had noticed the watch too, and his expression was troubled. "Uncle Dale, that's the watch Dad promised me when I graduated college. He said it was a family heirloom that would come to me someday." The social worker was writing furiously now, but I could see doubt creeping into her expression. The lawyer looked less confident than he had moments before. And Dale was starting to look like a man whose careful plans were unraveling faster than he could control them. "There's more," I said, my voice growing stronger as I realized the power I held. "Robert's letter mentioned that he'd hidden something you don't know about, Dale. Something that would give me the power to fight back." I walked to Robert's easel and examined the painting that was still sitting on it, an unfinished landscape that showed the view from this building. But as I looked closer, I noticed something odd about the paint layers. Robert had painted over something else, and in the afternoon light streaming through the windows, I could see the ghost of previous brushstrokes underneath. I picked up a palette knife from Robert's art supplies and carefully began scraping away the top layer of paint. Sarah gasped as numbers began to appear, not part of the landscape, but a sequence that looked like a combination. "Mom, what are you doing? You're ruining Dad's painting." "I'm revealing what your father really wanted me to find," I replied, continuing to scrape. The numbers were becoming clearer. 08, 15, 1979. The date Michael was born. I looked around the room until I spotted what I was searching for. A small safe built into the wall behind another painting. I'd missed it earlier because Robert had disguised it so well, but now I could see the slight difference in the wall texture. The combination worked on the first try. Inside the safe was a thick envelope with my name written on it in Robert's handwriting, along with a small digital recorder and what looked like legal documents with official seals. As I pulled out the envelope, Dale lunged forward. "Janet, don't. Those documents might be forgeries. Bobby wasn't thinking clearly when he what, Dale?" I interrupted, holding the envelope against my chest. "When he recorded your conversations about slowly poisoning him with digitalis. When he documented how you convinced him to hide his illness from me while you positioned yourself to steal everything after his death. When he gathered evidence of your plan to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could control his estate legally." The room erupted in shocked voices. Sarah and Michael were demanding explanations. The social worker was asking if she should call the police. The lawyer was backing toward the door like a man who suddenly realized he might be an accessory to murder. But Dale's reaction told me everything I needed to know. His face had gone from pale to gray, and his hands were shaking as he stared at the digital recorder I was now holding. "You don't understand," he whispered. Bobby was going to waste everything. The treatments weren't working. He was throwing away money that could secure your future. Sarah's future. Michael's future. Someone had to make the hard decisions. Someone had to commit murder, you mean? The words hung in the air like a physical presence. And what I was about to discover in Robert's final recordings would prove that my husband's death was just the beginning of a conspiracy that stretched back years and involved more people than I had ever imagined. I pressed play on the digital recorder with trembling fingers, and Robert's voice filled the room, weak but clear, speaking from what must have been just days before his death. "Janet, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and Dale has made his move just like I knew he would. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about my illness and my death." Sarah's face went white. Michael stepped closer to me, his protective instincts finally kicking in. Dale made another move toward the recorder, but the lawyer grabbed his arm and shook his head sharply. Robert's voice continued. 3 weeks ago, Dale brought me tea during one of his concerned brother visits. Within an hour, I was having chest pains and difficulty breathing. The second time it happened, I started paying attention. The third time, I had the tea tested at a private lab. My legs gave out, and I sank into Robert's chair as his recorded voice revealed the truth I'd been afraid to fully accept. The tea contained foxglove extract, digitalis, enough to cause heart problems in someone who already had a weak heart from the cancer treatments. Dale wasn't just waiting for me to die, Janet. He was helping it along. Margaret let out a strangled sound and collapsed into the nearest chair. Kenny was backing toward the window as if he were planning to run. But Dale was staring at the recorder with the fascination of a man watching his own execution. But here's what Dale doesn't know, Robert's voice continued. I've been recording our conversations for 2 months. Every time he came to visit, every time he brought up the power of attorney documents, every time he mentioned how much easier things would be for everyone when I was gone. It's all here, Janet. Every word. The social worker had stopped writing and was now staring at Dale with horror. The lawyer was already on his phone, presumably calling someone to distance himself from this situation as quickly as possible. In that moment, alone, I knew there was no turning back, but I found myself thinking, if you were in my shoes, would you have the courage to face it, or would you stay silent to survive? Write in the comments, I really want to know. Play the rest, I said, my voice steady now, with the kind of calm that comes when you finally stop being afraid and start being angry. Robert's recording continued with what sounded like a conversation between him and Dale. Robert must have hidden the recorder during one of Dale's visits because both voices were clear. Bobby, you need to be realistic about this. The cancer's going to kill you anyway. Why drag it out? Why put Janet through months of watching you suffer? Because those months are all I have left with my wife, Dale. They're precious to me. They're expensive is what they are. Every day you stay alive is another day of medical bills that eat into Sarah and Michael's inheritance. Is that really what you want your legacy to be? There was a long pause before Robert's voice, weaker now. What are you really asking me, Dale? I'm asking you to think about the people you're leaving behind. Janet's going to need help managing everything. The property, the oil rights, the legal complications. She's not equipped to handle complex financial decisions. Janet is one of the smartest people I know. Smart at teaching high school English maybe, but oil leases, mineral rights, corporate negotiations, come on, Bobby. She needs family to guide her through this. Family like you, family like me. Someone who understands business, who won't get emotional and make bad deals. I could hear Robert's labored breathing on the recording, and my heart broke for what he must have been feeling, dying, in pain, and realizing that his own brother was circling like a vulture. And if I refused to sign over power of attorney? Robert asked quietly. Then Janet's going to have a very difficult time after you're gone. Lawyers questioning your mental competency in your final weeks. Medical professionals concerned about the effects of pain medication on your decision-making. Children worried about their mother's ability to cope with complex financial matters. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. And now I understood how they had manipulated my husband in his final weeks. Sign over control, or watch his family be torn apart by legal challenges after his death. You've already talked to Sarah and Michael, haven't you? Robert's voice was barely a whisper now. I've shared my concerns about how grief might affect Janet's judgment. They're worried about her, Bobby. They want to make sure she has support. Sarah was crying now, her hands covering her face as she realized how she'd been manipulated into betraying her own father. Michael looked like he wanted to hit something, preferably Dale. The recording continued with more conversations, each one documenting Dale's psychological manipulation and subtle threats. But the final segment was the most devastating. Bobby, drink your tea while it's still warm. I made it special, just how you like it. What's in the tea, Dale? Just some herbs, natural remedies, supposed to help with the pain. Natural remedies like foxglove? There was a long silence on the recording, followed by Dale's voice, much colder now. You always were too smart for your own good, big brother. So this is how it ends? You poison me slowly and then comfort my widow while you steal everything I worked for? This is how it ends cleanly, with dignity, without months of suffering that bankrupt the family and leave Janet with nothing but medical bills. Janet would rather have me alive and broke than rich and without me. Janet doesn't get to make that choice. She's not strong enough for what's coming. But don't worry, I'll take care of her. I'll take care of everything. The recording ended with the sound of Robert refusing the tea and Dale leaving in anger. It was the last conversation they'd had before Robert's heart attack 3 days later. Dale was no longer looking at any of us. He was staring at the floor like a man who had finally realized that his perfect crime had been documented from beginning to end by the victim himself. "Call the police," I said to the social worker. "Janet, wait," Dale said desperately. "You don't understand the whole situation. The oil money. It was supposed to secure everyone's future. I was trying to protect the family. You were trying to murder your brother and steal his property. The cancer was going to kill him anyway. I just made it easier." Sarah looked up from her hands, her face streaked with tears. "Uncle Dale, how could you do this? How could you make us part of this?" But Kenny answered before his father could speak. "Because Grandpa always said that sentiment is expensive and family business is still business. Dad was just doing what needed to be done." The casual coldness in my nephew's voice made me realize that this wasn't just Dale's crime. It was a family philosophy that treated human life as a business expense and love as a weakness to be exploited. I stood up and walked to the door, still holding Robert's recorded evidence of his own murder. The police need to hear this. The district attorney needs to hear this. And Sarah and Michael need to understand exactly how their father died and who was responsible. But as I reached for the door handle, Dale's voice stopped me cold. "If you turn me in, Janet, I'll make sure everyone knows about Robert's other secrets, the ones that will destroy how your children remember their father forever." I turned back to face him, and what I saw in his eyes told me that even now, even with his brother's murder exposed, Dale Allen was still planning his next move. "What other secrets?" I asked, my hand still on the door handle. Dale's smile was the ugliest thing I'd ever seen. The expression of a man who had lost everything but still had one more card to play. "Oh, Janet, sweet, naive Janet. You think finding out about Bobby's little art hobby and the oil money was the end of the story?" Margaret looked at her husband with something approaching panic. "Dale, don't!" "Don't what?" he snapped at his wife. "Don't tell her the truth about her precious perfect marriage? About why Bobby really started hiding things from her?" Sarah and Michael moved closer to me, sensing that whatever was coming would be devastating. The social worker had put down her clipboard and was openly staring now, apparently having forgotten her official role in the drama unfolding before her. "There are no more secrets, Dale," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Robert's letter had hinted at complexities I didn't understand, and his journal entries had mentioned guilt about things beyond just hiding his illness. Dale pulled out his phone and scrolled through what looked like photographs. "Bobby wasn't just coming to this farm to paint pretty pictures, Janet. He was meeting someone here, someone he'd been involved with for over 15 years. My heart stopped. "That's not true. Her name is Catherine Morrison. She's a widow from Cedar Falls, about an hour's drive from here. Bobby met her at some art exhibition back in 2008, and they've been having an affair ever since." The room spun around me. I gripped the doorframe to keep from falling as Dale held up his phone, showing me photographs that made my world crumble. Robert, looking healthy and happy, embracing a woman I'd never seen before. Robert and this Catherine painting together in the very studio where I now stood. Robert kissing her in front of an easel, both of them covered in paint and laughing like teenagers. "No," Sarah whispered. "Dad wouldn't. He loved Mom." "Your father was a man with needs, Sarah," Dale said with cruel satisfaction. "Needs that your mother apparently couldn't meet." Catherine understood his artistic side, encouraged his painting, made him feel like the artist he always wanted to be instead of just a small-town mechanic. Michael snatched the phone from Dale's hands, scrolling through more photos with increasing horror. "These are recent. This one is dated just 3 months ago. Dad was already sick then." "Right up until the end," Dale confirmed. "Even while he was dying, he was more concerned about protecting his girlfriend than being honest with his wife." I sank into Robert's chair, staring at the paintings on the walls with new understanding. Half of them showed a woman's figure, always from behind or in profile, never clearly identifiable, but consistent enough that I should have realized they were all portraits of the same person. The woman my husband had loved while living a lie with me. "The art supplies," I whispered. "They're too expensive for a mechanic's salary." "Catherine has money," Margaret said quietly, looking ashamed, but unable to stop herself from adding to my humiliation. "Her first husband left her well provided for. She's been funding Bobby's art for years." Dale was enjoying this too much to stop now. And the medical treatments he was so desperate to continue? He wasn't fighting to live for you, Janet. He was fighting to live for her. The woman who understood him, who supported his dreams, who didn't spend 40 years making him feel like wanting to create art, was somehow beneath a working man. "I never made him feel that way," I protested weakly. "Didn't you?" Dale scrolled through more photos on his phone. "Catherine told me all about Bobby's complaints over the years. How you'd roll your eyes when he mentioned wanting to try painting. How you'd redirect conversations about art toward more practical concerns. How you made him feel guilty for wanting anything beyond your safe, small life." Each word was a knife twisting in my chest, because there was enough truth in them to make me doubt everything I'd believed about my marriage. Had I been dismissive of Robert's artistic interests? Had I prioritized practical concerns over his dreams? Had I failed my husband so completely that he'd felt compelled to build a secret life with another woman? The lawyer, who had been trying to edge toward the door during this family destruction, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Allen, this doesn't change the facts about your brother-in-law's criminal actions. Adultery isn't murder. But it does change Janet's moral authority to demand justice, doesn't it?" Dale shot back. "Hard to play the grieving widow when everyone knows your husband spent the last 15 years wishing he was married to someone else." Sarah was crying openly now, and Michael looked like he wanted to hit someone. Kenny remained by the window, watching the devastation with the detached interest of someone observing a natural disaster. But as I sat there absorbing the magnitude of Robert's betrayal, something began to shift inside me. The crushing weight of humiliation was slowly being replaced by a cold, clean anger that burned away the self-doubt Dale was trying to plant in my mind. "You're right," I said quietly, standing up from Robert's chair. "My husband was unfaithful. He built a secret relationship with another woman, lied to me for 15 years, and died without ever having the courage to tell me the truth." Dale looked satisfied, thinking he had broken me completely. "But you know what that makes him, Dale? It makes him a cheating husband. It doesn't make him any less murdered." The room went silent as my words sank in. "Robert's affair doesn't justify you poisoning him. Catherine Morrison's existence doesn't excuse you from manipulating a dying man into signing away his family's security. My husband's lies don't make your crimes disappear." I walked over to where Michael was still holding Dale's phone, looking at the photos of his father's secret life. "Give me that." As I scrolled through the images, I began to notice things Dale hadn't intended me to see. In several photos, there were timestamps showing when they were taken, but more importantly, there were location tags that revealed something crucial. "These photos weren't taken here at the farm," I said slowly. "They were taken at Catherine Morrison's house in Cedar Falls." Dale's confident expression faltered slightly. "So what? The affair still happened. So you've been to Catherine's house. You've met her, talked to her about Robert, which means you knew about the affair before Robert died." Margaret grabbed her husband's arm. "Dale, stop talking." But I was putting the pieces together now, and what I was discovering was even worse than murder for money. "You used the affair as leverage, didn't you? You threatened to tell me about Catherine unless Robert signed over power of attorney." Dale's silence was all the confirmation I needed. That's why he was so conflicted in his final journal entries. You weren't just threatening to steal his property. You were threatening to destroy his family by exposing his affair. You gave him a choice: die quietly and let his wife remember him as a loving husband, or fight back and watch his marriage be revealed as a lie. Sarah looked up from her tears. "Is that true, Uncle Dale? Did you blackmail Dad with his affair?" "I gave him options," Dale said defensively. "He could come clean about everything: the illness, the girlfriend, the oil money, and let the chips fall where they may. Or he could handle things quietly and preserve everyone's dignity. By drinking poisoned tea, by accepting reality and making practical decisions about his legacy. Michael stepped toward his uncle with barely controlled fury. You blackmailed our dying father, poisoned him when he wouldn't cooperate completely, and then spent months convincing us that Mom was having a breakdown so you could steal everything he'd worked for. I was protecting this family, Dale shouted. Bobby was going to waste everything on medical treatments that wouldn't save him anyway, and then Catherine would have shown up at the funeral expecting a piece of the inheritance. At least this way, the money stays with blood family. Blood family? I laughed, and the sound surprised everyone in the room, including myself. You mean blood family like the brother you murdered? Or blood family like the nephews and niece you manipulated and lied to? Or blood family like the sister-in-law you tried to have declared mentally incompetent? I pressed play on Robert's recorder again, fast-forwarding to a section I'd missed before. Robert's voice filled the room once more, but this time he was speaking directly to me. Janet, I know Dale will try to use Catherine against you when you find this recording. He'll try to make you feel like my betrayal somehow justifies his crimes. But you need to know something about my relationship with Catherine that Dale doesn't understand. Everyone in the room leaned forward, even Dale. Catherine Morrison is my half-sister. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Dale's face went gray, and Margaret actually gasped out loud. Robert's voice continued. Our father had an affair 57 years ago, and Catherine was the result. I only found out about her existence 15 years ago when she contacted me through a genealogy website. She wanted to know about our father, about our family, about the artistic talents she'd inherited that no one had ever encouraged. My head was spinning as I tried to process this revelation. All those photos of Robert with Catherine, they weren't romantic embraces. They were the joy of siblings who had found each other late in life. The portraits he'd painted of her weren't lovers' tributes. They were a brother, documenting the sister he'd never known existed. I kept Catherine's secret because I was ashamed. Robert's recording continued. Ashamed that our father had been unfaithful to our mother. Ashamed that there was a whole side of our family that Dale didn't know about. Ashamed that I was keeping another secret from you when I'd already hidden so much. Dale was staring at the recorder as if it had come to life and started speaking in tongues. That's impossible. I investigated Catherine Morrison. I know everything about her. You know what you wanted to see, I said, understanding finally dawning. You saw photos of Robert with an attractive woman, and you assumed the worst because that's the kind of man you are. You never bothered to find out the truth. Kenny spoke up from his position by the window, his voice shaking. Dad, if she's Uncle Robert's sister, then she's family. She has a legal claim to the inheritance. And that's when I realized that Dale's carefully constructed plan had just collapsed completely. Not only had he murdered his brother based on false assumptions about an affair that never existed, but he'd also overlooked a legitimate heir who could challenge any property transfers he'd forced Robert to sign. But as I reached for my phone to call the police, I heard the sound of multiple vehicles pulling up outside. Through the window, I could see squad cars and what looked like an ambulance. Someone had already called for help. And standing next to the lead police car was a woman I'd never seen before, but somehow recognized immediately. Catherine Morrison, Robert's half-sister, the woman my husband had died trying to protect from the same man who had been trying to destroy me. The confrontation wasn't over. It was just beginning. Catherine Morrison walked through the door like a woman who owned the place, which I realized with growing clarity she partially did. She was tall and elegant, with Robert's eyes and the same artistic hands that had created the paintings surrounding us. Behind her came 2 police officers and Detective Maria Santos, whom I recognized from community events over the years. I'm sorry I'm late, Catherine said, her voice carrying the same gentle strength I'd heard in Robert's tone when he was determined about something. I was giving my statement to the police about Dale's visit to my house 3 days ago. Dale's face went from gray to white. You never what? Catherine interrupted, pulling out her own phone. Never threatened to expose Robert's affair unless I signed documents transferring my share of the mineral rights to you? Never told me that Robert's wife was mentally unstable and couldn't handle complex financial decisions? Never suggested that it would be better for everyone if I stayed away from the funeral and let you handle the family's affairs? Detective Santos stepped forward with handcuffs already in her hands. Dale Allen, you're under arrest for the murder of Robert Allen, attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and about 6 other charges that are going to keep you busy for a very long time." "This is insane!" Dale protested as the detective cuffed him. "I was protecting my family. Bobby was dying anyway, and these women would have wasted everything he worked for." "These women," I said, standing up to face him one last time, "are smarter than you ever gave us credit for. Catherine has been recording your conversations for weeks, just like Robert taught her to. Every threat, every manipulation, every illegal offer you made is documented." Margaret stood up shakily. "Detective, I want to cooperate fully. I never knew about the poisoning. I swear I never knew Dale was actually killing Robert." Kenny moved away from the window, his young face showing a maturity that shouldn't have been necessary. "I want to cooperate too. My father made me help with some things I didn't understand at the time. I thought we were helping Uncle Robert make good financial decisions." Detective Santos nodded to the other officers, who began reading Dale his rights while he continued protesting his innocence and claiming he'd only been trying to help family members who couldn't help themselves. Sarah and Michael rushed to my side, both of them speaking at once. "Mom, we're so sorry. We should have listened to you. We should have questioned Uncle Dale's version of events." "You were grieving," I said, wrapping them both in a hug that felt like coming home after a long, terrible journey. "And you were manipulated by someone who spent months setting up this deception. Don't blame yourselves for trusting family." Catherine approached us cautiously. "Janet, I know this is overwhelming, but I wanted you to know how much Robert loved you. Every conversation we had, every letter he wrote to me, was full of stories about your life together. He was terrified that his secrets would hurt you, but he never stopped loving you for a single day." I looked at this woman who shared my husband's artistic gifts and his gentle spirit, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. "He never told me about you because he was protecting you from Dale, wasn't he? Robert figured out months ago that Dale was investigating his finances, his activities, his relationships. When Dale started asking questions about my visits to the farm, Robert realized that having a secret half-sister could be used as leverage against him. So he stopped mentioning me in his journals, stopped bringing me to the farm, and started meeting me at my house instead. But Dale found you anyway." "Dale found me, but he misunderstood what he found. He saw a woman who had been important to Robert, and he assumed the worst. When he came to my house last week, he was so confident about his interpretation of our relationship that he never bothered to ask the right questions." Detective Santos finished with Dale and approached our group. "Mrs. Allen, we'll need formal statements from all of you, but I want you to know that between Robert's recordings and Catherine's documentation of Dale's attempts to coerce her, we have enough evidence to put him away for a very long time." "What about the oil money?" Michael asked. "What happens to the property now?" Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out a folder of legal documents. "Robert and I hired a lawyer together 6 months ago, as soon as he realized Dale was planning something. The mineral rights are held in a family trust that names you, Sarah, and Michael as the primary beneficiaries, with me as a secondary beneficiary and you, Janet, as the trustee." I stared at the documents, trying to process the complexity of what Robert had set up. "He protected all of us. He protected all of us," Catherine agreed. "Even from beyond the grave, he made sure Dale couldn't steal what belonged to the people he loved." The social worker, who had been silent through most of the dramatic revelations, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Allen, I'll be filing a report that you are completely competent to make your own decisions and that the concerns raised by your family members appear to have been motivated by financial gain rather than genuine worry about your welfare." As the police led Dale away, he turned back one last time. "Janet, you don't understand what you've done. That oil money comes with complications. There will be legal challenges, corporate pressure, people trying to take advantage of you. You're not equipped to handle what's coming." "Maybe not," I replied. "But I have family to help me, real family. The kind that doesn't poison people or steal from widows or manipulate children against their parents." Catherine smiled at me. "Robert always said you were tougher than you looked. I think he would be proud of how you handled this." 3 hours later, after all the statements had been given and all the evidence had been cataloged, I found myself sitting in Robert's art studio with Sarah, Michael and Catherine, looking at paintings that finally made sense to me. They weren't portraits of a lover. They were portraits of a sister, painted by a brother who had finally found the family connection he'd been missing his entire life. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. I thought about the oil money, about the legal battles that were probably coming, about the fact that I was a 67-year-old widow who was about to become very wealthy and very visible in ways that would bring their own challenges. "Now we figure out how to be a family," I said. "All of us, together." Michael picked up one of Robert's brushes and examined it thoughtfully. Dad always said he wasn't artistic. I wonder what else he thought he couldn't do. "Maybe," Catherine suggested gently, "we can find out together. There's a whole art studio here, and Robert left instructions for all of us about how he wanted his work to be preserved and continued." Outside, the sun was setting over Thompson Farm, no longer a forbidden place of secrets and deception, but a sanctuary where Robert had found his sister, his art, and himself. Dale was in custody, his plans destroyed by his own greed and the careful preparation of a dying man who had loved his family enough to protect them from beyond the grave. But even as we sat there planning our future, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dale's warning about complications and corporate pressure hadn't been entirely wrong. The oil money would bring its own challenges, and there would be people who saw a group of women as easy targets for manipulation or fraud. The difference was that now I knew what real family looked like, and I was no longer facing those challenges alone. 6 months later, I stood in the same art studio where my world had been turned upside down, but everything was different now. The walls held new paintings alongside Robert's work, Catherine's landscapes, Sarah's surprisingly talented portraits, even my own tentative still lifes that Robert would have gently encouraged and lovingly criticized. The oil drilling had begun 3 weeks earlier, and the first royalty check had exceeded everyone's most optimistic projections. We were wealthy now, in ways I was still learning to understand. But wealth, I'd discovered, brought its own complicated sorrows. Dale had been sentenced to 25 years to life for Robert's murder. Margaret had received probation in exchange for her cooperation, but she'd moved to Florida to live with her sister, unable to face the town where everyone knew her husband was a killer. Kenny had been granted immunity for his testimony, but the knowledge of his father's crimes had aged him in ways that broke my heart. He'd started college in another state, trying to build a life separate from the family name that would forever be associated with greed and murder. Sarah visited the farm every weekend now, sometimes bringing her children to play in the meadows where their grandfather had found peace in his final years. She'd taken early retirement from her nursing job to help me manage the complicated business of oil royalties and mineral rights. And she'd proven to have a natural talent for negotiations that impressed even the corporate lawyers. Michael had moved back to Cedar Creek with his family, taking over management of the farm's day-to-day operations and converting one of the outbuildings into a workshop where he restored classic cars, a passion he'd inherited from Robert but had never had time to pursue. Watching him work with his hands, seeing the same focused concentration Robert had brought to his art, was like having a piece of my husband back in the world. Catherine and I had become the sisters I'd never had, bound together by Robert's love and Dale's betrayal in equal measure. She'd helped me navigate the grief of learning that my marriage had been built on decades of small deceptions, while I'd helped her process the guilt of being the secret that Robert had died protecting. But not everything had healed cleanly. The town looked at me differently now, some with new respect for the woman who'd uncovered a murder and claimed a fortune, others with suspicion about what other secrets might be hiding behind my quiet teacher's exterior. Old friendships had become complicated by money and notoriety, and I'd learned to recognize the careful way people spoke to me now, as if I might either help them or destroy them depending on my mood. The oil company executives who came to our monthly meetings still treated me with the patronizing courtesy they reserved for elderly women who'd stumbled into wealth, despite the fact that I'd negotiated contract terms that had impressed their own lawyers. I'd enrolled in business courses at the community college, determined to understand every aspect of the agreements I was signing. But the learning curve was steep and sometimes humiliating. Worst of all were the nights when I lay alone in the bed I'd shared with Robert for 43 years, wondering what other truths he'd hidden from me. The art, the sister, the oil money. What else had my husband kept secret because he thought I couldn't handle it, or because he was afraid I wouldn't understand? Dr. Patricia Welsh, the therapist Catherine had recommended, helped me work through the complex grief of mourning a man whose love had been real, but whose honesty had been selective. "You're grieving the husband you thought you had," she'd explained, "while learning to love the husband you actually had. That's not a contradiction. It's the messy reality of loving imperfect people." This afternoon, I was expecting visitors, oil company representatives who wanted to expand the drilling operation to include fracking, which would triple our income but potentially damage the aquifer that supplied water to half the county. It was the kind of decision Robert would have agonized over, weighing our family's financial security against the environmental impact on our neighbors. I walked to Robert's easel, where his final painting still sat unfinished. A portrait of me reading in our kitchen, captured with the loving attention to detail that comes from 43 years of studying someone's face. He'd been working on it during his secret visits here, probably planning to give it to me for our anniversary. Now I would never know what he'd seen in my expression that day, what emotion he'd been trying to capture in the careful brushstrokes around my eyes. The sound of cars on the gravel road interrupted my thoughts. Through the window, I could see the familiar black sedans that meant corporate visitors, but there was also a police car that made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Detective Santos got out of the patrol car, along with a man in a suit I didn't recognize. The oil company representatives were climbing out of their vehicles with the careful expressions of people who'd received unwelcome news on their drive here. I opened the door before anyone could knock, and Detective Santos's grim expression told me everything I needed to know before she spoke. "Mrs. Allen, we need to talk. We've arrested Margaret Allen in Florida on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. She's been cooperating with federal investigators, and what she's told them changes some things about your husband's case." The man in the suit stepped forward. "Mrs. Allen, I'm Agent Harrison with the FBI. We have evidence that your husband's murder was part of a larger scheme involving fraudulent mineral rights transfers across multiple states. Dale wasn't working alone, and this wasn't his first victim." I sank into Robert's chair as the implications hit me. Dale hadn't just been a greedy brother who'd killed for money. He'd been part of a network of people who targeted elderly property owners in rural areas, manipulating them into signing over valuable mineral rights before arranging their deaths to look like natural causes from existing health conditions. "How many people?" I asked quietly. "At least 12 that we've identified so far," Agent Harrison replied. "All elderly, all with valuable property, all with existing health problems that made sudden death seem plausible." One of the oil company representatives cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Allen, in light of these developments, we need to postpone our meeting today. There may be complications with the existing drilling contracts if they were obtained through fraudulent means." Detective Santos held up a hand. "The contracts your husband signed were legitimate. The fraud occurred in the attempted transfer of those rights to Dale Allen. Mrs. Allen's ownership is not in question." But as I listened to Agent Harrison explain the scope of the investigation, I realized that my quiet life as a widow with a secret fortune was about to become much more complicated. I would be a key witness in a federal murder conspiracy case. There would be media attention, court appearances, testimony about intimate details of my marriage that I was still learning to understand myself. Catherine arrived as the law enforcement officers were finishing their explanation, and I saw my own thoughts reflected in her worried expression. We'd thought we were done with the worst of this nightmare, but we were actually just beginning to understand its true scope. After everyone left, Catherine and I sat in Robert's studio, watching the sun set over the oil derricks that now dotted the landscape where Robert had once found peace in solitude. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never found that key?" Catherine asked. "Every day," I admitted. "But then I remember that Dale would still be out there, killing other people, and we'd still be living with lies we didn't even know existed." A car door slammed outside, and we looked up to see a young woman walking toward the building with a manila envelope in her hands. She looked nervous but determined, and something about her purposeful stride reminded me of myself 6 months earlier. When she knocked on the door, I opened it to find a stranger who introduced herself as Emily Patterson. "Mrs. Allen, I'm sorry to bother you, but I think your brother-in-law might have killed my grandfather too." I looked at Catherine, who nodded slightly. We'd known this moment would come. Other families discovering connections to Dale's network, other victims seeking justice for loved ones whose deaths had seemed too convenient. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let Emily enter. "Let's talk." As she began telling her story, I realized that my transformation from quiet widow to reluctant detective was far from over. Robert's death had uncovered a conspiracy that stretched across state lines and involved dozens of victims. And somehow I'd become the person other families turned to when they needed someone who understood what it meant to discover that a loved one's natural death had actually been murder. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, and share it with someone special who needs to hear what I lived through. This is a space of love and respect, and every day there's a different story of strong, courageous women who never gave up. Outside, the oil derricks pumped steadily under the darkening sky, extracting wealth from ground that had been soaked with too much blood. Tomorrow I would call Agent Harrison and tell him about Emily Patterson's grandfather. Tomorrow I would continue learning how to be rich and powerful while staying kind and honest. Tomorrow I would keep fighting for justice for Robert and all the others who died for the greed of people who saw elderly lives as obstacles to profit. But tonight I would paint. In Robert's studio, using his brushes and his colors, I would create something beautiful in the space where so much ugliness had been revealed. It seemed like something he would have wanted. Art rising from ashes, beauty growing in ground that had been poisoned by lies. The painting I started that night was a portrait of Emily Patterson as she'd looked when she walked through my door. Young and afraid but determined to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She reminded me of myself, and I wanted to capture that moment when an ordinary person decides to become extraordinary, when grief transforms into purpose, when love becomes stronger than fear. Robert had taught me that, even in death. Even through all his secrets and lies and imperfect love, he'd taught me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost.